Great. Okay. So welcome everybody. And I just want to say welcome to our 9th Cooperative Women's Voices event. And today we're going to be talking with Mirai Chatterjee. So welcome, Mirai, who's a director of the Social Security Unit at SEVA, which is a self-employed women's association based in Gujarat. So as I always do in these sessions, we just give a brief background really to the Cooperative Women's Voices event. So it's a joint project between Corp News and the Cop College. And we run a series of conversations really with women across the global cooperative community. And the overarching aim and goal is to raise the profile of women's voice across the cooperative movement and to engage in a rich and creative discussions on issues that are important to women in the movement. And these women will be role models for other women. So it's important. We've always felt it's just important to understand the source of women's lives, the journeys and the passions, really. So, and it follows really from the Cooperative Women's Challenge Programme, which was launched in 2010 through the Cooperative Group. And that was designed to empower women working in the cooperative movement in the UK and asking them, how can women support each other? How can we build each other's confidence? And also, how can we ensure a healthy work-life balance? And it also then follows on from in 2017, we also did a series of Cooperative Women's Voices face-to-face events. So really, this is just the kind of the conclusion, really. We've opened it up internationally. So as I've just said, we're absolutely delighted to welcome Mirai Ben. So Mirai has worked for over 40 years at SEVA, now being the director of the Social Security Unit, and is currently chair of WEAGO, and we've got some WEAGO people here. And WEAGO seeks to increase the voice, visibility and validity of women in the informal economy. And Mirai is also on the board of Save the Children in India. So before I hand over to Bex, so me and Bex tend to alternate each time. So Bex is going to lead on the questions today. But before I hand over to Bex, just some really quick housekeeping. So during the questions, keep yourself on mute, pop questions and comments in the chat function. And because it's quite a small group, we might get you to kind of talk and potentially ask those questions as well. And myself and Bex will also make sure that you get your questions and comments aired. So without any further ado, over to Bex, and welcome again. It's an absolute delight, Mirai, that you're here. It's it's a joy. So welcome.
Thanks.
Mirai, welcome from me as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and thank you for everyone who's joined us as well. As Sarah said, please do keep yourself on mute for now, and this session will be recorded and we will be putting it on YouTube at some point in the not too distant future, hopefully. So Mirai, welcome again. So we're going to have a few questions. We're going to have a very, very loose conversation, and if anyone in the chat does have questions, please do put them in the chat. So first of all, Mirai, a loose question about, what started you on your cooperative journey? Where have you come from, and what have you experienced to get to where you are today?
Thanks, Rebecca and Sarah, for the very warm welcome. I'm very pleased to be here, also representing the SEVA Cooperative Federation of 110 primary women's cooperatives in the state of Gujarat. So I think my journey began, as it often does for many of us, with my family. My parents were the first generation of young adults who were born in independent India. Well, they became young adults in independent India, and they were idealistic and fired up with ideas of nation building. And I think, from a young age, those kind of ideas and values of solidarity, of sharing, of giving back to society and fellow citizens was very much in one's upbringing, and also the circle of friends around my parents. And my mother was widowed very early, unfortunately, but she had a supportive sisterhood around her. So I think that also had a very big impact on my life, because I was surrounded by women in a country which, about 50 years ago, 60 years ago, it was quite unusual, who were not only educated, but were competent, or what we could call can-do women from an early age. So all those were important influences. And then also school and teachers. my school in I'm a native Mumbaikar from Mumbai, Bombay, it used to be called. And I went to a school where there were a lot of children like myself who had opportunity and were born into a certain amount of privilege. But our teachers purposefully took us to see the other India. And I remember at the time in Mumbai, there were settlements of informal workers who were construction workers, who were basically rural poor refugees, economic refugees. And they were building the gleaming glass and steel buildings that are now called Nariman Point, our business center in Mumbai. And yet they had no dwellings. They had nothing for their children. They had no medicines for their children. And I think as an impressionable 14-year-old, that made an impact on my life. And I realized that poverty is an outrage. Poverty is unacceptable in any civilized society, any society for that matter. And that something had to be done about it. So I didn't really know what, I was too young. But I was fortunate after my education, during the time I was a university student in the US, I heard about SEVA because I was interested in the labor movement. I was involved in the boycott of table grapes of United Farm Workers while at college, and also the whole South Africa divestiture movement, divesting, investments, US investments in South Africa, at apartheid South Africa at the time. And that's when I heard about SEVA, and some friends told me about it and I hadn't heard. And so I made it my business to find out. And so almost 40 years ago, I met Ila Ben, and she said, look, we need young people like yourselves to join the movement. And so I signed up, I guess. And 4 decades later, I'm still here learning every day and just amazed by my SEVA sisters every day. SEVA, of course, is a national union. It's a national union of almost 2 million women workers in the informal economy spread across 18 states of India. Of course, when I joined SEVA, I remember our membership was about 8 or 10,000. Hard to imagine now, but it was at that time. So everything has small beginnings. And as we organized women into the union, we realized in labor surplus economies and societies like ours, it's not enough to have the typical union approach. Firstly, because the mass of informal workers are self-employed. Secondly, because they have very little bargaining power and staying power. And so when they organized for minimum wages, when we organized women for minimum wages, their strike was very quickly broken by merchants and contractors who singled out the women leaders and the most vulnerable. And it was then that the women said, look, we know how to sew, and why can't SEVA get us together and get us the raw material and help us with marketing, so that we don't have to go anymore to these exploitative contractors, merchants, and middlemen. And that's really how SEVA's entry into cooperatives and the cooperative movement began, and my own exposure as well, because women formed their own cooperative. They already had the model of SEVA Bank, which is even today a women's cooperative bank, started way back in 1974. So that model was there of collectivization and collective action and collective social enterprise. And then this art group of artisan women got together. And amazingly, we found that when they got together, formed their cooperative, and the cooperative did well and gave women work and income at non-exploitative rates, automatically the middlemen and merchants in the neighborhood had to raise the wage rate. So we found by accident that this was a very interesting and important strategy to organize informal women workers, what we now call the joint action or joint strategy of unions and cooperatives. And that's really how our journey and my own journey in cooperatives, as I said, began. And I think perhaps this is something that's fairly unique in in the history of the cooperative movement, although I understand in the UK, in Denmark, Germany, and other places, a lot of cooperatives were formed by trade unions. But in India, it's quite unique, I must say. I myself am trained as a public health professional. I did my degree in public health, switching from medicine. So I didn't know much about cooperatives, to be perfectly honest. I learned about organizing. I cut my teeth on that at SEVA in the early years. And then when we started our community-based primary healthcare program, Ilaben Bhatt, our founder, and her husband, late Ramesh Bhai, took me under their wing and said, you know, why don't you cooperativize this group of health workers that you have trained as primary care workers? And to me, that just seemed, how is that possible? But slowly they worked on me, and we organized our cooperative, and the first 50 health workers put up their shares, and off we went to the registrar's office to be registered. And he took one look at us, a motley crew of traditional midwives, grassroots health workers, and somewhere there I was stuck in. And he just said, this is not possible. How can you have such a cooperative? What will you manufacture? How will you ever be financially sustainable? And the women said, just try us, give us a chance. And that took us 2 years to convince them. Fortunately, it doesn't take our cooperative so long now. And well, as they say, thereby hangs a tale. That was 30 years ago. Not only is the health cooperative Lok Swasthya financially viable, for years now, it's been run by the grassroots health workers themselves. It has won several awards at the state level and nationally. And during COVID, they played a very, very special role, as you can imagine. So that's really how my journey with cooperatives began. And then one thing leads to another. I was asked to work with the childcare cooperative, and then insurance, and then SEVA registered India's first national cooperative, insurance cooperative, Vimo SEVA, and SEVA's first as well. So far, most of the cooperatives have been state level and district level.
It's absolutely fascinating, Mirai, how you've like gone on that journey. I'm also really interested to hear what other women have influenced you on that journey, because you mentioned your mother in the sisterhood, and you mentioned Ilaben as well. Were there any other women who've really influenced this journey of yours?
Absolutely, all along the way, lots of women and some men also. When I first joined SEVA, I was put with one of our founder members of SEVA Bank. Her name was Suman Datania. Unfortunately, she is no more. And later, Chanda Ben. Suman Ben was what we call datan vendor, traditional toothbrush made out of certain shrubs. And Chanda Ben was an old clothes vendor. Her trade was going around to neighborhoods, collecting old clothes and then bartering them with steel vessels. And neither of these women had been to school ever, but they were sharp as tacks. They took me under their wing. They made me their daughter, and they took me to all the low-income neighborhoods of Ahmedabad, and they showed me what life and living is all about, what solidarity is all about, what are the needs of poor, struggling, informal workers. So I really owe them a debt. I think of them often with much love and gratitude. So there was them, then there was Leelaben Bachubhai, who also was a vegetable vendor, also never went to school, but was an ace camera person in our video cooperative. And then there's Aisha, who had been abandoned as a little girl, but became one of our strongest health workers, and even went to Senegal and found another Aisha there and told her all about cooperatives and how to set up a health cooperative. So there's an unending line of amazing SEVA sisters to whom I'm ever grateful.
Talking of sisters, and I think probably most people here know what Ben means, but so you refer to Ila Ben, and sometimes we see her as Ila. So can you explain or talk a little bit about the Ben part?
Sure, sure. So we live in the state of Gujarat. That's where SEVA and the SEVA movement and SEVA's cooperatives began. And something quite unique about our state is that everyone is referred to as sister and brother. So Ben, Ila Ben, Rebecca Ben means sister Rebecca. Automatically we say that. And for men it's Bhai, so it would be Ben Bhai. So, I think that also just the language and the culture that fosters solidarity and cooperation to some extent as well. And at least it, if nothing else, it breaks down hierarchies because we're all sisters and brothers and we're all on this journey together.
So let's talk a little bit about the specific challenges of the women members of SEVA. So what are the specific challenges? Because when we had a chat just before this, you're talking about the informality, about the poverty, about the caste, about the gender. So what exactly are the challenges all associated with that?
Sure, Rebecca. So first and foremost, perhaps it's important to stress to the audience that informality means that people have no work and income security, little food security, and little or no social security or social protection. And obviously for women in almost every country, including mine, India, women are the most discriminated, the most invisible, and the most forgotten, although we know they do most of the work, both inside and outside the home. And what we were seeing again and again is that women faced several layers of inequality and discrimination as informal workers, as poor workers. I mean, they form the large poverty segment of our country. Then as women in a deeply patriarchal society like ours. And fourthly, most of our members and most of the informal workers, and this, by the way, is being brought out in recent studies by the government itself, most of the informal workers are from the most disadvantaged and deprived and discriminated against castes and communities in India, including ethnic and religious minorities. So that is the demographic, and obviously women face double, triple, quadruple, whatever levels of discrimination, layers and layer upon layer upon layer. So that is the first thing that I'd like to share. And then as we organized informal women workers, their needs came out very clearly. Obviously, livelihood is central. If you are a poor working person, the first thing you think of is livelihood and how to secure your work and income in a situation where the vast majority are self-employed and the others have shifting employment relations. Today I work for you, tomorrow I work for someone else if I'm lucky. So marked by really insecure world of work. But then, of course, as I said, that is their priority, livelihood. In fact, their whole lives, it's a lifelong quest for livelihood and work security with income security. Because obviously, if you have income, then you can eat and feed your children and your families. And then close on the heels of work and income security would be food security. We are in a better position now, but we are still a hungry country. And unfortunately, COVID has made it worse. Our studies show that our members, and this is not only in SEVA, WeGo studies also show this, that our members have cut back on food, both the quality and quantity. Several of our members went several days without food during the pandemic. So we are a hungry country. We're a country of contradictions where we have surplus food grain and export to other countries, but still many of our people don't have enough food to eat. And then social security, as we call it at SEVA, or social protection, as is more widely known these days. In our experience, at least healthcare, childcare, insurance, pension, and housing with basic amenities like a tap and toilet in every home. Surely that's not too much to ask for. These are the basics of life. essential for all of us in every country. So these are the basic needs. And then, of course, financial services. Our members, as I said, many of them are self-employed, and even those who are not need a line of credit. They were saving, but no banks would give them loans because they said, oh, these poor women, they'll never pay back. They'll take the money and disappear. And SEVA Bank and our bank depositors have proven how false that is. The entire microfinance movement in India and other countries has shown that actually women are the best borrowers and best for paying back and on time. Even during COVID, our members would line up at SEVA Bank and pay their loan installments, maybe a little delayed, but it is really quite remarkable. And then capacity building. I mentioned that many of my mentors at SEVA had never been to school, or they had not got much education. They didn't have the opportunity. They were too poor. They had to be pulled out of school to work. This is the reality. And so capacity building, training, both to run their own cooperatives. For example, how to run the board, how to maintain minutes, how to read a balance sheet. But also technical trainings, whether it's on organic farming or on IT, digital literacy, and so on. All of these are required. In SEVA, we often say that women need 4 pillars for their economic empowerment and self-reliance: financial services and asset building in women's name, social protection, which I've just mentioned, capacity building, and last but not least by any means, voice and representation, so that there's voice and representation at various policy fora where policies, programs, and laws are made for us, but without our consent and without consultation. And just to give you a small example, in the cooperative movement in India, which is quite vibrant, I must say, less than 3% are women's cooperatives. And in all the national and apex federations of cooperatives in India, state level, and even national level, we hardly see any women. There's one woman on the board of the National Cooperative Union of India after much pushing by many of us. They have now a women's committee, but we have our work cut out.
It really sounds like you do. Is that changing at all, Mirai? Are you seeing any movement? Are there more women, or is it still quite a static situation, women in leadership?
Well, sure. Specifically in the cooperative movement and the trade union movement, we have a way to go in the senior leadership. They're really strong leaders at the grassroots level and even middle level, both in the trade union movement and the cooperative movement in India. And I'm sure this is the case in many countries. When it comes to senior leadership positions, that is where we have to look very hard. Although women, we know, are more than ready. And thanks to the women's movement in India, I mean, that is another major influence on women like myself, because we were teenagers when the women's movement took off in the 70s and 80s in India, and there were mass demonstrations for the first time. Millions of Indian women took to the streets. It was powerful. So I think, there is some good news. I think from the time when I was in school and a teenager and to now, there has been forward movement vis-a-vis women's rights and equality in India, but obviously we have far to go.
So in the chat, I think it's Laura who has asked, Laura Murillo has asked, did India have an ecosystem such as regulations and institutions for the development of co-ops when SEVA Cooperative Federation was founded? Was that in place then?
Thanks a lot, Laura. That's a really good question. Well, under the Indian Constitution, cooperatives are a state subject. As you know, we have a federal system in India, and states are required to make their own cooperative laws. So in Gujarat state, where SEVA was born and where most of SEVA's cooperatives are located, we have historically had a very strong cooperative movement and quite a strong cooperative department as well of the government, which as I said, it took 2 years to register our health and childcare cooperatives. But now, we don't have that situation anymore. They're more amenable to cooperatives. But that is not the situation in other states of India where SEVA is organizing. In the state of Bihar, in eastern India, for example, our SEVA cooperatives there have been having a tough time. So the first thing is that cooperatives are in each state are subject to the laws of that particular state, and they can be quite different. That's point number one. Point number two, the good news is that in 2012, there was a constitutional amendment which passed through the Indian Parliament, which has made forming cooperatives and organizing for cooperatives actually a constitutional right. So this is actually a major step forward, although there are some sub-clauses which many of us are not comfortable with because it impinges on the autonomy of cooperatives, and those are being challenged in the Supreme Court of India. But by and large, I would say that since independence, there has been a sort of push towards cooperatives and the cooperative movement, because it was understood from the early days of our freedom struggle that cooperatives can be a way to help local people, rural people to come together and emerge from poverty and move towards self-reliance. And of course, our leaders of our freedom movement like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru and many others were influenced by what was happening in other parts of the world. They were influenced by the Russian Revolution and the cooperativization. They were influenced by the friendly societies and the cooperative movement in the UK, because many of them had studied in the UK. They were influenced by Fabian socialists and by the cooperative movement in the UK. So all of those had a major influence on the way cooperatives were viewed in the early days of India's independence, and also the push from the very top, from the political leaders, from the first Prime Minister of India onwards.
Thank you, Mirai. So I'm just looking at the chat here. There's some excellent questions coming in on the back of what you're saying. Sonia, this is a really good question. She's of Sonia Diaz. Hi, Sonia. So Sonia is in Brazil, and she says, in times of shrinking democracies, such as in Brazil and India and elsewhere, what strategies do we need to adopt to enable the co-op movement to thrive within that environment?
Well, that's a very good question, Sonia, and we ask ourselves that every day. In many of our countries, the space for civil society and civic action is either shrinking or under threat. So the question is extremely pertinent. But having said that, the current government in India has just set up a Ministry of Cooperation. They are working out a new cooperative policy. They have asked us for recommendations, and SEVA Cooperative Federation has submitted those recommendations to the government of India. So there is a window of opportunity there. But always in countries like ours, and maybe all countries, there is a concern, a fear of political capture, because whichever be the political party, they understand that cooperatives have reach. They enjoy trust of people at the grassroots. And political parties and movements are keen to get their hands into that. So yes, we have to be on our toes. We have to be cautious. We have to keep our wits about us. And I think most importantly, we have to keep doing what we are doing, which is we have to keep organizing. We have to keep on keeping on with our head to the ground. And our ears to the ground, and wherever there is a space, a window of opportunity, put forth our experiences and needs so that the laws and policies and regulations are in favor of informal workers and women. But yes, it is a tough atmosphere to work in, and there are no easy answers. The only thing organizations like ours know to do, and you would know this very well, Sonia, and also Laura and others, is to organize and build our collective strength and bargaining power, not just to stand firm in the marketplace, but vis-a-vis vested interests and all kinds of forces. that try to, well, pull us apart and destroy our unity and solidarity.
It's interesting that you mentioned, oh, hello, Bernadette, you're coming in and out. It's very interesting, you know, you bring up the political angle, because I was having a conversation recently with ResCoop, who are the Federation of European Renewable Energy Cooperatives. And one problem that they're having is they're finding it very, very difficult to organise in Eastern Europe, especially because of basically the hangover of communism. And, you know, a lot of people still associate cooperatives with forced collectivization and don't want anything to do with it. They don't like the word cooperative. So there's definitely the historical angle that has a huge impact on whatever you're trying to do today. So Sonia, best of luck with what you're doing in
yeah. No, I just want to say that's quite common in many countries. You know, cooperatives are not necessarily connected in people's hearts and minds with solidarity and with movements for social and solidarity economy. And also in India, many people think, you know, cooperatives are a den of corruption and so on and so forth. And they're not entirely wrong in some cases.
Well, in the UK, a lot of people think just Co-op is a shop, and that's it, because it's one of the major brands here. So everyone thinks Co-op is the name of a shop, not actually a way of organising or a way of doing business. It is fascinating, isn't it? Absolutely fascinating. Neha Christie says, hello, Mirai. We still have work to work hard to gain political power for women in dairy co-ops in Gujarat. What are your suggestions to create space for women in the governing board of well-established dairy co-ops? And I guess this could be, you know, any well-established co-op where men are the predominant force within that organization.
Well, the whole dairy cooperatives, and thanks for that question, Neha, in Gujarat, are particularly galling because all the work around cattle and cows and buffaloes and even small animals is done by women actually, and sometimes children, you know, from cleaning their stables to gathering fodder and so on. But when it comes to voice and representation, and so I appreciate Neha's question, they are nowhere. And SEVA had worked with the National Dairy Development Board to change this, and we managed to set up 65 women's dairy cooperatives. And I must say, with the support of the late Dr. Verghese Kurian, who's considered the father of the Amul and cooperative movement in Gujarat. But it's always a challenge, because whenever these cooperatives were floundering and were in bad shape, you know, the men of the village, because these are village-based dairy cooperatives, laughed and made fun when women tried to resurrect and revive these cooperatives. Now, the moment these cooperatives were revived through sheer hard work and honesty of the women, then the men showed up and wanted to take over the show. And we see, even despite SEVA, even despite our organizing, I mean, there's a limit to what we can do. We don't have any magic wand here. Many of the men have taken over the cooperatives. And especially when technology comes in, oh, women can't use technology. They don't know how to do computers. They don't know how to use these machines, chilling machines and so on, which of course we know is complete nonsense. But this is a fact, and not just in dairy cooperatives. In any collective enterprises, the hard work seems to be done by women, and when they're flourishing, suddenly all kinds of people swoop in. So we have to guard against that. We have to constantly remain in contact and do what we can to organize, build up women's capacities, build up their digital literacy. But at a certain moment, you know, how much can women fight the men of their own families? So we have to leave it finally at the end of the day to them and their strength and their collective strength, and hope for the best.
Thank you, Mirai. I'm going to bring it back to you now and ask a couple more questions about yourself, because this does feed into the questions that are also coming through the chat from Abigail, and a follow-up question from Sonia too, about the idea of mentoring and solidarity and support as well. You mentioned several role models earlier within the different areas that you've worked in. So I guess my question is, what message would you like to give to women in today's world as a mentor to them? And then alongside that, you know, in terms of Abigail's question, what have been the most helpful forms of solidarity and support the SEVA Foundation has received from international partners over the years? So both yourself and SEVA, if I may.
Sure. So I see several of my younger SEVA sisters on this call, so they will smile when they hear me say this. I think my big message to our younger sisters is to spend as much time with informal workers at the grassroots level, at the field level, so that we're always close to them, that we're always true to them, that we always listen to their needs, their priorities, their hopes and dreams, so that we are guided in all we do by them, actually, that we should never be far from them. So I think that is point number one. I mean, in the early days of SEVA, I remember for 6 months, all I did was go to one low-income settlement on the riverbank and sit there and listen and observe and absorb. Now my younger colleagues don't have that luxury because we give them all kinds of things to do. They have to hit the ground running. But there are ways to keep on being as close as possible and keep on listening to the members. You know, every time I go to a village, every time I go to where our members live and work, I come back with some new insights and some new ideas for action. So they are our guiding force, they are our moral compass, and they help us stay true to our principles and values and the direction of our movement. So that would be my biggest message. What else? I think, be patient. I mean, there are times when I haven't been patient. I mean, this is all, organizing informal workers into unions and cooperatives is all about staying power. You know, it took 2 years to register the cooperative. We didn't give up. It took us, every struggle. It took us 30 years to get street vendors law passed by the Indian Parliament finally in 2014. So it's all about a marathon. You have to hang in there. And, the women put trust in you, trust them and also stand by them, whether you continue with SEVA or not. Stand by them at all times, because it is a long haul, and we may or may not see the fruits of our labor. That's not important. What's important is to keep organizing and to keep the movement going. And yes, the other message I would say is bring younger women like yourselves. I've had the privilege of such an enriching journey, and a journey that has given direction to my life. It's our responsibility to make sure that other women also enjoy and have the privilege of this journey, and at the same time contribute to their sisters' struggles and empowerment.
And in terms of Abigail's question,
Mirai. Yeah, Abigail's question, sorry. Yeah, sorry, Abigail's question. Yeah, Abigail, thank you for that. And thank you for your excellent study as well on unions and cooperatives. I think for us, what's been really important, and that's why SEVA was a founder of WeGo, was the aha moment, the realization that what we were going, our struggles in India with our sisters are not only common to our sisters across the border in South Asia and Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Bhutan, but also everywhere else, in Latin America, in Brazil, on the African continent, in Southeast Asia, like Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia. So that is why the whole idea of building WeGo, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, was born, because our struggle is common. We really need to unite in one movement. Look how capital has united. What about workers? We need to unite across borders. We are one. Our struggles are one. There are nuances. Context is important. But when I go to Thailand, or when I go to Mozambique or Tanzania, I see there's so many parallels. So one thing is building the movement, and it's been important for us to be linked up to the International Cooperative Alliance, Asia Pacific. Office is happily in New Delhi. So we have a lot of interaction and collaboration with them, obviously with the International Labour Organization. and also internationally with the ICA, International Cooperative Alliance, and others like SECOPA and the International Health Cooperative Organization also we're a member of. So just as SEVA is a member of various federations of labor, trade union movement, like the ITUC and IUF, so also we have been enriched by these linkages. And now our latest linkage, which is with the UK cooperative movement, at a time of darkest despair for us and the second wave of the pandemic in India, which you all know was just beyond description, and the devastation and loss of life. The support of the UK cooperative movement was not only very touching for us, that we were not alone at this dark moment, but also that we were able to support our sisters both in emergency relief and then long-term rebuilding of the cooperative through livelihood support, for which we are very grateful. And we look forward to a continued interaction with the UK cooperative movement. And I thank you both, Rebecca and Sarah, because I know that you were very key to building this new partnership and sisterhood.
I think that's the key word, isn't it, Mirai? It's that sisterhood and that partnership and that solidarity, which is so very, very important. I'm going to squeeze in Sonia's email before we move on. We've got about 15-20 minutes. Sonia says, a follow-up question. In the sector I work with, in spite of the support received by both from NGOs and even national governments, in 15 years, not even 20% of workers are affiliated to co-ops and associations. The great majority is unorganised, and in fact, many seem to have difficulty to adapt to co-op principles. How can we address this issue? It's a very good question, Sonia.
Very good question indeed, Sonia. I think one of the challenges we faced as a union, which then went ahead and formed cooperatives, was what we call the issue of mindsets. Mobilizing and organizing into a trade union and fighting for your economic rights and better working conditions is a certain mindset. And running your own cooperative, which is basically a business, a collective business, it has to work, it has to make profit, or in cooperative language, it has to make surplus, is a whole nother mindset. So, it's hard, at least in our experience, for women who have been workers, either working in some field or been contract workers or waste recyclers or whatever, to suddenly think of themselves as doing collective business. I mean, I know, for example, that many of my SEVA sisters who are waste recyclers, all their lives they were walking the streets at dawn collecting recyclables, and suddenly they form their cooperative, which is great, but they have to run it in a financially sustainable manner. They have to produce stationary items, which is not easy for them. I remember many of them didn't even know, why would they know? But they didn't know that paper comes from trees and that they're providing such an important service in the context of climate change and so on. So there's a lot of hard work, a lot of mindset change, a lot of capacity building. And of course, some women get it and they get it quite fast, and others take a while. So I think it's not an easy question to answer. And cooperatives will always be a smaller subset of the informal workers movement. The Amul dairy cooperative, which is always quoted as one of the big cooperative successes in India, is a whole different cup of tea. For example, for starters, most of the farmers who are cooperativized weren't poor and struggling. The fact that you had 1 or 2 buffaloes and cows means that you're not rock bottom poor. So the kind of groups that you organize, Sonia, and we do, waste recyclers and others, they are really the poorest and most vulnerable of all workers. So not easy to organize, not easy to get them to sort of understand the importance of a business mindset. And as I said, our experience has been that rather than these large Amul type cooperatives for informal workers, many small local cooperatives work better. Our sort of average size of cooperatives is 1 to 500 shareholders. I remember in Turkey, the women said, you call that small? But anyway, by our standards, it's small. So small cooperatives federated together for collective strength and bargaining power, that seems to work. But cooperatives can never be anywhere near the trade union movement in size for the reasons that I've mentioned and more.
And there's a lovely comment here from Abigail. I'm just going to read it out. In a context where UK politics is increasingly insular and xenophobic, you're very right, Abigail. I am pleased to hear that co-op movement international solidarity is remaining strong and finding diverse ways to support workers. The same is also true of the union movement, which I am closely involved in myself. You're right, Abigail. It's that international solidarity which is so hugely important to the global co-op movement, and that actually leads me neatly onto my next question, which is about the International Cooperative Alliance Global Conference, the World Cooperative Congress, which is happening a week today. It's starting next Wednesday, and I know Mirai, yourself and Ilaben are both speaking at the conference. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and also the theme of the conference is deepening our cooperative identity. So in the context of that, what does cooperative identity mean to yourself?
That's a good question, because I feel both a cooperative identity and a union identity. And I don't think that they are necessarily sort of juxtaposed. I mean, I think cooperative identity to me means living the values and principles of the cooperative movement, which have been very clearly stated by the International Cooperative Alliance. And happily, they match very well with SEVA's own values, which are taken from Mahatma Gandhi, of solidarity, of truth, of integrity, of support to the local employment, of uniting people of all castes, communities, religions, and so on. So and mutuality. So all of these, go down very well with SEVA members. They make a lot of sense, and they make a lot of sense to me because these are the values of our SEVA movement. And as I said, they match very well. So I think we do have a cooperative identity. I myself as well, I think of myself as a long-term cooperative member of various cooperatives, but perhaps most especially the health workers cooperative, where sort of was my first baby, if you will. But so I have a special kind of connect there, working with my sisters there. But I think the cooperative identity is not something, and it links to Sonia's question, that is easily sort of comes about easily or automatically. And especially, and for some of the reasons I mentioned already, but also especially in countries like mine, which are so divided by caste, class, religious identity, linguistic identity, every division in the book. So bringing people together and building a cooperative identity is a huge challenge for many countries, and certainly in mine. But yes, we're looking forward to the Congress in Seoul, Korea. Unfortunately, we are not able to get there in person because of all kinds of visa complications. But we will listen in with interest. Apart from myself, several of my colleagues, we have registered, and we'll be listening to all of you speak and learning from the experiences of cooperators worldwide.
Thank you, Mirai. Thank you so much. If anyone has any other questions, do pop them in the chat now. I'm going to ask Mirai one more question, and then we'll go to the chat and we'll open up for any other questions people have. And it's a question, Mirai, it feels slightly even more informal than our conversation so far, but it's something we've asked all our women guests so far, so we're going to ask you too, is if you were stranded on a desert island, what would you, Mirai Chatterjee, take with you to sustain you on this island?
Well, first of all, I won't be very happy to be stranded on a deserted island. I'd like to be back with my cooperative sisters as soon as possible. So I would have with me definitely water, without which no one can survive, and some food, a good stock of food, particularly dry food like dry fruit. I'm vegetarian, so I wouldn't be too thrilled about fishing for survival. And then I would like to have some means of communication so people know where I'm stranded, like a satellite phone or flares, so they can quickly come and take me and bring me back to where others are and the cooperatives are.
Wonderful 3 items, Mirai. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bernadette in the chat says, Bernadette Turner says, I just wanted to say what a truly inspirational journey.
Oh,
yeah, it has been, Mirai. Your story is fantastic. And when we were chatting before we actually had this session today, you mentioned that you'd spent some time in Wales in the UK as well. Could you tell us a little bit about that, what you were doing there?
Sure. So in my school in Mumbai, someone I knew, a family friend, had applied for a scholarship to study at United World College in Llantwit Major, actually, in Glamorgan, South Wales. And it all sounded very exciting. So I just took a shot in the dark and applied myself and landed up in Wales. And I had not ever been there before. But it was a really enlightening experience in many ways, because we were all kind of 16-year-olds from all over the world. And, I think it opened my eyes there too, to the struggles of poverty in many other countries. A very close friend of mine still is Brazilian. And there were people from the African continent, from Indonesia. And so we learned so much from each other, but we also learned from the local community. I was involved in community work. I chose to do that as my service. We were required to do service. And I spent a lot of time talking to Welsh miners, actually, including miners who were pensioners, and learning about their struggles and learning about the fact that even in rich countries like the UK, there is poverty, there are health struggles. They had so many health problems because of coal dust. So all those things also, I think, had an impact on me as a young person. And again, I'm grateful for the privilege of having all those experiences, and to the Welsh miners and others in the village.
You've had a very, very varied life, traveling around the world, meeting all these amazing men and women. I wonder if you could share, like, finally, maybe a story of where you've seen cooperatives have the most impact, whether that is with SEVA or whether it was in Brazil or Mozambique, all the places you've struggled. So what's the one cooperative situation where you've seen it make the biggest difference and that has impacted you the most, do you think?
Well, apart from SEVA, another organization on whose board I serve is called Pradhan. And this is an organization that works in central and eastern India, where large numbers of informal workers and the poorest of Indians live, actually. And mainly they are indigenous, we call in our language Adivasi. And these amazing Adivasi women have built their village level, they're not formally registered cooperatives, but they've built village level collectives and then federated them at district level. And some of them are registered as cooperatives, and some of them are not formally registered as cooperatives, but they work on cooperative principles, and they live and struggle in incredibly difficult conditions. These are the most exploited Indians and the original inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent. 8% of our population are Adivasis. So it's not a small number, and they've been exploited all through history, really. And to see and also in their area, there are strong sort of secessionist movements, Maoist movements. So they get squeezed from all sides, by the guerrillas and by the government and the police and so on, because they're accused of harboring them, etc., etc. But the fact is that they have revitalized their community. They live in resource-rich areas. but they are farming, they are taking up all kinds of non-traditional activities, they're doing sericulture and on a large scale. So it's inspiring to me. And plus the forests of central India are still so beautiful. So that itself is inspiring. The elephants still come across at night and we have to be careful when we go.
That sounds like a wonderful place. I'd love to maybe visit one day and meet you in person, Mirai, and meet other SEVA members.
Sure, I'd love to.
One day, one day. There's a couple of thank yous in the chat. I'm going to read them out. So thank you so much, Mirai Ben, for sharing your journey and sharing so many important messages from Laura Murillo. Thank you, Laura. And Neha as well says thanks to Mirai, Sarah, and Rebecca for this enlightening session. And I'd just like to say thank you from myself and Sarah again, Mirai Ben. It's been an absolute privilege to hear your story, and thank you so much for sharing it with us all.
Oh, thank you, Mirai.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and greetings to all the sisters and brothers in the cooperative movement.
Great.
All good wishes.
Thank you.